I'm now joined by Jonathan Leighton. Hello, Jonathan.
Hi, Lawrence. How you doing?
I'm amazing. Thank you. I hope you're well too. Thank you for giving up your time and joining us. So I will give Jonathan a quick introduction as to what we'll be talking about and the work he's sort of generally done. And then Jonathan's got a presentation that we'll go through, and then we'll go into questions. So Jonathan is the executive director of OPIS, which many people know it by, but that stands for the Organization for the Prevention of Intense Suffering. He's also the author of 2 books on ethics. One of them is The Tango of Ethics, Intuition, Rationality, and the Prevention of Suffering, as well as OPIS's recent publication, Compassionate Governance, which is a strategic guide to preventing and alleviating global suffering. So today, Jonathan is going to be talking to us about tackling intense suffering. Very quickly, before I hand over to Jonathan, I just want to remind people that we are doing a fundraiser for MSI Reproductive Choices. So you can find the link to that in the description. It will be shared in the chat shortly as well. Please give generously. Every donation is matched up to £750. Thank you so much for those who have donated already. Jonathan, I'll hand over to you for your presentation. Are you all okay with sharing the slides?
Yes, just making sure.
Okay, great.
Because I haven't used this interface before.
Yes, so I've just added them to stage, so you should be able to see them now.
Okay.
And you should be able to switch between the slides?
With the left and right key, I suppose.
Yes.
There we go. Okay.
Yes, great. Okay, over to you.
Okay. So yeah, thanks a lot, Lawrence, and it's a pleasure to be talking here, and thanks to everybody who's joining. I think actually, Lawrence, it was you who suggested including the word tackling in the title of my talk, and So I'm not actually a rugby player, but I thought that this image of a rugby scrum covers or is a good metaphor for the challenges we face and the incredible messiness of the task. Maybe as a way of starting, I want to just say that I think I'm not a card-carrying antinatalist myself, but what I want to say is that I think it takes a lot of courage to be authentic and to face truths about existence that a lot of people don't want to face. And it means resisting a lot of strong societal pressures and norms. And so I just want to applaud everyone who's engaging with the theme of antinatalism to acknowledge the reality of suffering in a way that a lot of people refuse to do openly. And of course, a lot of this can be linked or explained by our existence bias. The term existence bias was coined by philosopher Thomas Metzinger, and basically means the idea that humans will do almost everything to prolong or to maintain their own existence. And of course, the slide here shows cryonic tanks where rich tech people try to preserve their existence indefinitely into the future. Which I mean, from a perspective on personal identity that I think is more accurate, this doesn't really make much sense, anyways. But it just shows you how deeply hardwired these Darwinian urges are. Let me just talk a little bit about the suffering itself. What is suffering? I mean, in a sense, we all know what it means intuitively. But if you want to be just a little bit more precise about it, I think there are 2 aspects. There's the unpleasantness, and there's the desire to be rid of it. And I would say that probably neither of them is really enough alone. So unpleasantness, even if it's severe, if it were voluntary and we chose to be in an unpleasant situation and continue being in that situation, that wouldn't really be suffering in the true sense, especially if you can escape whenever you want. And the other aspect is the lack of ability to change things is not necessarily enough. If there's no unpleasantness associated with it. And I'm just mentioning that because, there are people that there have been proposals to explain or to describe suffering in a different way, such as a lack of agency. I think that's an important part of it, but I think really central to it is the essential unpleasantness. Now, what I mean here, well, obviously suffering is bad, but I mean it in a deeper sense, that suffering is bad in a deeper, irreducible way. In the sense that this is actually what we mean by bad when it comes down to it. You can't really explain bad in a deeper sense. There's not really any other way of saying why suffering is bad. It is bad in a sense that's just deeply intuitive, and this is true regardless of whether we interpret it as having led to beneficial outcomes later on, and sometimes people justify suffering in that way after the fact. The very experience of suffering is just irreducibly bad. And what's also true about this is that suffering has a unique urgency about it, a unique urgency or a unique call to action. And that's true of suffering, but not of other states. It's not true of bliss. If somebody is incredibly happy, they don't need anything to be changed about it. But it's also true of nothingness. Here I showed a picture of the planet Mars. There's no inherent need for nothingness to be transformed into bliss. It's something that we might like as external observers who are, especially if we're not concerned about any suffering that may arise, but there's certainly no inherent need to change things when there's nothing. And suffering is also not simply the opposite of happiness. I mean, at least not in a mathematical sense. Conceptually, we think of them as being, polar opposite states, but the point is that they don't balance themselves out mathematically. And yeah, this is illustrated in a slide from a short film I made several years ago. This idea that it doesn't matter how many blissful beings happen to be present elsewhere. There's no way in which suffering is actually ethically neutralized by having blissful beings elsewhere. And this is a really important point, because people who adopt a classical utilitarian view of ethics will say that if really for any amount of suffering, you can imagine a large enough amount of happiness elsewhere that would balance it out. And I think this just does not make sense, because suffering is always has a call to action, regardless of how many happy beings there are elsewhere. Just a note about the terminology, which it doesn't really fundamentally change the nature of the question and the urgency of dealing with suffering. But what I want to say is that I tend not to use the language of moral realism. I try to avoid terms like ought, should, right, and wrong. I do talk about badness, as I just mentioned, suffering being inherently bad, and that a situation with less suffering, all things being equal, is better. But when we try to label actions with the language of moral realism, I think that we're using words that are less meaningful than we think they actually are. So I prefer to use more specific terminology, like whether an action is in line with a certain moral theory, or whether it actually seems to be the most reasonable course of action, rather than trying to apply sort of tidy labels of right and wrong. And as I said, this may not be all that relevant for what we're talking about, but it does somewhat change the framing of the question, and I think it actually can allow us to just be more pragmatic in the way we think about things. Now, I always seem to include a slide referring to Omelas, which, as some of you may know, is it's a short story that was written a few decades ago by Ursula Le Guin, and it's basically the story of a city where everyone is blissful, but it all depends on one child living a life of misery in a basement. And I keep coming back to this slide because we can interpret what it means in a few different ways, because some people do leave the city because they realize they don't want to be responsible for a child suffering. But I think what's also interesting sort of a related point, is that it's only separation that makes suffering tolerable, that makes the intolerable tolerable. It's a physical separation that actually shields us or creates an illusion of separateness when there isn't any. And I want to explore this in a little bit more detail with a couple of thought experiments, which I included in my book, The Tango of Ethics. So I'll use this slide to illustrate both of them. So the first scenario is this, and I'll pose it as a question. Would you agree to one copy of yourself, so being really absolutely identical to yourself in every way, would you agree for one copy to be brutally tortured for a year so that many other copies, it could be 1,000, it could even be a billion, could experience endless bliss? Now, would you agree to that, knowing that that would mean that one copy of you, essentially you, would be experiencing horrible suffering? And would you agree, if you would agree, or let's say you wouldn't agree to that, what about imperfect copies, which is really what we all are in this world. We're all imperfect copies of one another. If you would agree, then you're saying that you think it's okay for yourself to be tortured. And if you wouldn't agree for yourself, but you would agree to it being somebody else, then then there's an inconsistency in your argument, because you're allowing someone very similar to yourself to be tortured, but not yourself, if you see what I mean. And the conclusion here is that a life that contains unbearable suffering can itself be viewed overall as unbearable, as it contains what can be seen as a society of sequential consciousness moments in which bearableness does not outweigh unbearableness. And similarly, the life of an actual society of sentient beings that contains such lives can also be considered unbearable. And this can also be understood more clearly if you see, instead of all of these different copies of yourself living simultaneously, with most of them living bliss and one of them being tortured, if you looked at them sequentially, it would be like one life in which you're experiencing bliss most of the time, and then you go through horrible, unbearable suffering, which you wouldn't be able to voluntarily endure, and then go on to blissful living again. In other words, it would require us to go through a bottleneck of unbearableness, which means that you could say that the whole life is unbearable. I don't think this is the way that most people tend to think of it, but I think it's a pretty strong argument for why even single instances of unbearable suffering make the whole situation unbearable. In my book, I presented another slightly different scenario, and where I asked the question, could you voluntarily experience unbearable suffering yourself in order to spare many others the same fate? Or instead of putting all the burden on yourself, could you agree to share the burden more evenly? And the fact is, you wouldn't be able to do so voluntarily by definition, because we're talking about unbearable suffering. And the conclusion, again, I'm quoting here from my book, these thought experiments further illustrate something profound about the nature of unbearable suffering and about ethics. The most urgent ethical call to action, basically to prevent as much unbearable suffering as possible, could never be carried out voluntarily by taking on some of the burden oneself, without the constraint of irreversibility and the associated loss of autonomy. So we are left with a paradox. We can stick our heads in the sand and take irrational refuge from it, based on the illusion of separateness, leaving other versions of ourselves to experience what is unbearable, including as a result of decisions we erroneously think are rational, or we can regard the suffering as our own and take every measure possible to prevent it from ever happening. So this is really just intended to put in perspective the profound intolerability of extreme, unbearable suffering, and how it's really this illusion of separateness that allows us and other members of society to tolerate it. if we want to go after suffering, we need to be able to, and to be effective, especially if we aren't able to wipe out all of it at once, we need to try somehow to quantify it and to make sure we're really going after the worst suffering. And what I'm showing you here is one of the questions in a survey that we put out end of last year and beginning of this year, where we tried to gather data on the suffering caused to humans by various different conditions. And this is one of the key questions, asking people on a scale of 0 to 10 how much they were suffering, with 10 being the worst suffering imaginable, literally unbearable suffering. The results of the survey, it took us some time to crunch all the data, but I've just finished writing up a post, and I'm going to be putting it in the Effective Altruism Forum in a couple of days. And so yeah, I encourage you all to read it. We got nearly 500 respondents, and although it was a survey, it wasn't large enough to gather lots of data on, or enough data on every condition. It did give us some indications of how we can actually improve a next iteration of it. What kind of questions, how do we ask the questions so that we can really gather a sense of, get precise information on the duration of suffering at different intensities. And this can help us to build up an overview of the global burden of suffering. And I would add, not just in humans, but also in animals. Obviously, animals can't take surveys, but we can ask experts what their opinions are, or how they would estimate animal suffering in different situations. The study is also intended to populate a database with suffering metrics. And I proposed that we actually adopt new metrics for suffering, because the metrics that are already used for policy making and for health economics, like the QALY, the DALY, and the WellBe, none of them directly measures suffering itself. I mean, they may be correlated in some way with suffering, but they look at things like how much a life departs from a healthy one, how many years of life are lost, or it looks at increases in life satisfaction. But none of these is exactly the same as suffering. Suffering metrics have been proposed, including by a Lancet Commission paper a few years ago. But there's a problem when we try to aggregate lots of different kinds of suffering into one single value. And I talk about this in my book, The Tango of Ethics, the idea that there's no really non-arbitrary way of combining very different intensities of suffering into a single number. And that's why I think it's important that we have more granular measures that really focus in on severe suffering, where we would determine years lived with severe suffering, let's say from 7 to 10 on a scale of 0 to 10. And then specifically the most extreme suffering, 9 to 10 on a scale of 10, and even using the unit days, because just to capture just how terrible this kind of suffering is, even if experienced on short timescales. And so we would like to see these kinds of metrics being adopted and being used in parallel with existing health metrics. Now, what I want to show with this slide is a point I think is actually really important. Now, fractals, as you may know, are they're basically derived from, I think, fairly simple mathematical equations, and they are the patterns that you get from these equations. And what happens is that even as you zoom in more and more, you see the same kind of pattern repeating. And I think this is a very good metaphor for the problem of addressing suffering. Because there isn't any level of extreme suffering that is okay, no matter how few or how many zeros you add to the order of magnitude. So we might be reducing the scale of the suffering, but the task ahead of us remains the same. And by the way, this is also why the notion of S risks, or astronomical levels of suffering, it may be valid in terms of the priorities. I mean, if you have to choose, you would rather prevent as much, huge amounts of suffering rather than smaller amounts of similarly extreme suffering. But the term could potentially appear to devalue the significance of low quantities of extreme suffering. So the point here is that even one single instance of extreme suffering that was left in the world would still require our full attention and resources. So basically, we do what we can with the knowledge we have and the resources available. It's basically a problem that will always be there as long as there's extreme suffering around. We might be successful in reducing a huge amount of suffering, and we can congratulate ourselves for having achieved something that we care about, but the task will still be there. Even if it were just one single person or one animal left that was suffering at an extreme level, it would still be worth spending the same amount of resources until we could eradicate it. So I'm going to spend some minutes now talking specifically about antinatalism and the question of to what extent antinatalism is part of the solution. First of all, I want to quote from the Tango of Ethics. Intentionally creating new beings who will be burdened with a combination of intense suffering and a hardwired motivation to endure it is objectively perverse. But the question is, as a strategy, does it make sense in theory, and is it practical? And I think there are two obvious goals. One is this more ambitious goal of human extinction overall, and another lesser goal would be to just reduce the number of people around. Now, what's obviously clear is that fewer humans means fewer human suffering, and it means fewer humans causing animals to suffer. But what would be the net effect on suffering of having fewer humans? It's interesting, Magnus Vinding was just giving a talk before, and I thought that maybe there would be more overlap because we have some very similar views. And it turns out that our talks are very complementary. But he's argued in the past that because more humans means fewer wild animals, for example, due to agriculture and urbanization, therefore there's less wild animal suffering, and the presence of humans might actually be net positive. And this effect is probably strongest among large land animals, where declines of maybe around 90% have been estimated compared to historic figures. So from a purely utilitarian perspective, we want to know the net average marginal impact on suffering of having one more or one less human. And this is actually a really complicated question, because for this we need to know more about the determinants of sentience, which animals can suffer, and the intensity of the suffering in humans and in factory farmed animals, but also in wild animals. And there are large uncertainties here that will strongly affect the impact. I did some sort of back of the envelope kind of calculations yesterday. I haven't really engaged that much in these numbers, but just sort of roughly, there are around 10 to the 10 humans around who consume perhaps 10 to the 12 land and sea animals every year. And a very, very rough guess for the number of sentient wild animals around, it could be 10 to the 14. It may be much, much higher. And it really depends also on whether insects are not only sentient, but are they capable of suffering. So if there used to be, let's say, 10 to the 15 sentient animals before humans appeared, and if there were really a 90% reduction, that would mean that close to the 10 to the 15 wild animals have been saved from existence and suffering, compared to 10 to the 12 humans and animals we currently consume. Now, let's just take one form of wild animal suffering, predation. It's obviously a pretty horrible way to die. And it's still unclear, though, how much suffering it causes overall in the wild compared to an animal that's been tightly caged in a factory farm. If human existence has actually reduced predation of highly sentient beings by around 90% or even 50%, then there's probably a strong argument to be made, not an airtight one, but a strong argument that maybe the current status quo is better than the one before humans arrived on the scene. But then I would ask the question, is that really the best we can do? And it's also possible that we could reduce the number of humans around, and by extension, the number of animals tortured by humans, without substantially increasing the number of wild animals. So that was just all I really wanted to talk about in terms of numbers. And I think there's the more we know about sentience, the better we'll be able to at least make the utilitarian calculation more exact. But then there's the question of practical feasibility. Human extinction, in my view, appears extremely unlikely to happen through the activities of a movement. But I think it is possible that many individuals could be persuaded to have fewer children. This slide is, well, it's intentionally provocative and in some ways meant to sort of trigger the emotions. You could call it an ethical concern, which is that even if, from a utilitarian perspective, antinatalist advocacy were counterproductive because of wild animal suffering, the question still remains: how would we feel about bringing people into the world who might suffer, so that they can prevent wild animals from suffering? Would we use our own children for that purpose? And if not, why would we silently encourage others to do so? It raises the question also: how strongly utilitarian are we? In fact, are we okay to use people as a means to an end? And again, I'm just raising the question. This is not a definitive judgment one way or the other. What I will say is that if we are ever able to address wild animal suffering on a large scale, we will need humans around, as well as a functioning high-tech society. So I'm going to quote again from my book, The Tango of Ethics. A truly utopian future without extreme suffering is unlikely to happen through voluntary extinction, but through ethical governance and the benevolent use of technology. The systemic alleviation of the widespread intense suffering of wild animals will require some large-scale interventions in the future. And for that to happen, it is essential that humans don't go extinct. The extinction of humans while wild animals continue to suffer, and on the other hand, the persistence of extreme suffering in humans while fewer wild animals exist, are both unacceptable solutions unless we really think these are the best we can ever do. And so I refer back to the fractal metaphor that I gave just before. Our goal should really be to, I think, to be ambitious and to really aim for zero extreme suffering at some time in the future. And again, that will require the ethic of non-suffering to be widely adopted, and it will require human resources and technology. There's also the question: are humans likely to go extinct anyways? I mean, if you look at fertility rates, they're in free fall, as this graphic shows. They're still above the replacement level in lower income countries, and including in Africa. In Europe, they're well below replacement levels. I still don't think this means that humans are going to naturally go extinct, unless there's some sort of dramatic event that happens, even in the case of societal collapse. Well, what about extinction as a possible outcome of artificial intelligence? And how does that compare with our concern for suffering? I mean, if extinction of everything would, by definition, be good from a suffering perspective, does that mean that X risks are good from a suffering perspective? And I would just point out that we're not talking about some sort of instantaneous event that just makes everything disappear, but rather a chain of catastrophic happenings that could cause great suffering in the present. And it probably wouldn't do away with all wild animal suffering. So I think we can probably conclude that that there are better ways of dealing with suffering than just hoping that AI that will cause catastrophic events and just cause everything to disappear. There is also the concern about artificial suffering. Now, I don't think it's very likely to occur in digital systems as they exist currently, but it is possible that an AI could replicate and build suffering in artificial systems on a very large scale. So, this is something which a lot of people are concerned about. as especially in the suffering-focused community. There's also, even if AI doesn't maintain control by itself, it can be used by authoritarian regimes to carry out torture-level suffering within their borders and also beyond, to be instrumentalized to cause suffering. I just gave an example of one dictator here, but I think as we can see in the world today, there are others that are other places where there's a real slide towards totalitarianism, and it's very worrying that how these regimes using AI could actually cause a lot of suffering. So yeah, as I was just saying before, I think in reality, pushing for tight AI regulation to prevent suffering and for greater global cooperation seems the safest approach, rather than, as I said, waiting from the sidelines and quietly hoping that AI will do away with everything. In terms of strategies to effectively address suffering, well, this slide actually shows the two approaches that we're taking with Opus. One is to advocate for solutions to the specific causes of intense suffering, and the other, let's say, more meta-level approach is to promote compassionate ethics and systemic change. And I'll just spend a few more minutes talking about this. So obviously, the surest way, ultimately, of reducing suffering is to alleviate it directly, because all suffering is ultimately local. And I want to give you a couple of examples of that. These include, providing pain relief to humans and animals, and treatment of the underlying condition, especially to people and animals in excruciating pain. In some cases, voluntary euthanasia is the kindest option, with a heavy emphasis on voluntary. But I would also add, it is cruel not to make available the best treatment options that would make euthanasia unnecessary. This is one slide showing some of the work we've been doing. This is from Burkina Faso, where we helped organize a conference a few years ago. There are many people in the world who end up dying of terminal cancer, and they don't have access to morphine. So one of the sort of, if you could say it's an imperative to ensure that anyone in extreme pain has access to medications that can alleviate it. And another cause area that we've been working on is access to psychedelics to treat the excruciating pain of cluster headaches, one of the most painful conditions known to medicine. And it turns out that psychedelics are very effective where other medications fail. So we've also been pushing for them to be legally available, at least in a medical context. And of course, ending the moral catastrophe of factory farming, which the number of animals that are tortured on factory farms far exceeds the number of humans around. Now, again, if you take a very, very pure utilitarian perspective, it's been argued, not by many, but by Brian Tomasic, for example, that that it may be that on balance, removing large amounts of wild land in order to carry out agriculture to feed factory farmed animals might actually be net positive from a suffering perspective. I'm very doubtful about that, whether that's even true from a numerical perspective. And even in the case that were true, I would say that would be it would mean settling for the stability of large-scale human cruelty because we think it's better than the alternative, which I think lacks ambition. I think clearly we want to try to change consumer habits, which is obviously not so easy because the number of vegans in the world hasn't really been climbing continuously. I think that just as a practical point, it would be worth focusing as well on adequate nutrition, because a lot of people do go vegan and then they revert, sometimes just for practical means, but it seems that a lot of people just don't get the nutrition that they need because they've been told, just take B12 and you're good. There are other things that, it's worth paying attention when somebody goes vegan, giving them nutritional information to make sure that they do get enough protein and they're not lacking any nutrients, because it doesn't do any good for animal welfare if people mistakenly believe that they can just switch from one day to the next without looking at their nutritional needs. And obviously we need to provide alternatives like cultured meat, and that means also fighting the ridiculous legislation that has been already passed or could be passed, supported by the animal agriculture lobby, for example, to ban the use of terms like milk or burger for plant-based foods. I just want to show you a few more slides. I do believe that there's a potential for dramatic change if we're able to organize ourselves effectively. And this is a picture from the Manhattan Project, just as a sort of a metaphor. And what this means is promoting the core value of preventing suffering and its widespread implementation in government policies worldwide. And this could potentially have greater and longer lasting impact if successful than just sort of narrowly focused advocacy. This means strategically ensuring that movements for change incorporate concern for suffering, including of animals, as a core value, and making suffering, again, including of animals, a mainstream issue in our society. This is the publication that we came out with just a few months ago. And there's a QR code, which I could have I could paste the link as well, but if you have your phone available, I invite you to download this for free as a PDF from our website. It's basically what it says. It's really meant as a guide for a wide audience, where we've pulled together ideas and wisdom from different fields and different experts, which we think will be useful or even essential for large-scale change. Everywhere from ethics to actual policies, with reflections on things like power balances and insights from complex systems and how we can improve governance to better take into account suffering, including that of animals. So yeah, I mean, this slide is just really meant to say that I think there are two things that really matter. And effective altruism talks about the heart and the mind, or the head and the heart. I'm saying something similar with this, but the idea is that this is more from a strategic perspective. We need to show empathy. I mean, I'm thinking now back to Magnus's presentation, where he was somewhat wary about too much empathy. But I think just as a way of getting people to cooperate, and to listen as well as to be listened to, showing empathy towards others, and not just those who are suffering intensely, but just showing that we care about them, is really a key element of a more compassionate world. But we also need to use strategy, and this, that whether we're dealing with governments or corporations, empathy isn't always enough. We need sometimes to provide positive incentives and negative ones to ensure good behavior and cooperation. How to represent animals? This is another question. In the guide, we advocate for better deliberative democracy that allows issues to be addressed more empirically, potentially with better outcomes. And if you notice here, there's a chicken sitting on one of the chairs, and that's just really meant to depict the idea that we need to have animals and their concerns and their needs represented. They may not be literally at the table like in this picture, but we need to ensure that as part of the process of deliberation, that concern for suffering, including of non-human animals, is always taken into account, and the relevant elements are presented by experts. Insights from complex systems. This is really about ensuring that we're not overly naive in our strategy, that we take into account what the study of complex systems can tell us. And I'm not going to go into detail here. I really encourage you to read the actual publication. Although, you know, one of the things it says is that we should try out lots of different possibilities and then promote the ones that work the best and allow them to spread. So diversity is actually a benefit. It allows for experimentation. But I did want to quote from Yanir Bar-Yam, who's the head of the New England Complex Systems Institute. And he, I quote him a few times in the guide, and he wrote, "Collectively, the power of the populace is strong, generally stronger than any leadership. But individuals or even groups of the populace have respectively less power if they do not act in a unified way." I think that's a cause for optimism. If we can create a larger movement where we act together with concern for one another, there's a real chance to affect large-scale political change. And what we ultimately want is just that, a movement for change based on listening to and addressing needs of every sentient being, and with priority to those who are suffering the most. So that's the end of my talk. The two websites here are my own personal website and the Opus website, and you have my email address here as well. And so I think we have a few minutes left for any questions. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, no, Jonathan, thank you. And I'm going to bring the slides off screen, but we will obviously send out a newsletter after the conference with everyone's links. So everyone will have access to your links with the guide from Opus and your book and everything else. Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. So I wanted to start by asking about something you mentioned briefly, but I thought was quite interesting. I thought would be very interesting to this audience specifically, which is, so this conference is about trying to encourage antinatalists and those sort of in that general space to pursue doing good, right? And one of the things that is going to come up again later in the conference is this idea of and it's relevant to your talk in pursuing doing good or reducing suffering. You might engage in actions that actually could have negative consequences or negative externalities, right? So unintentional consequences. And you give the example of it could be possible that by antinatalists pursuing avoiding imposing suffering by not procreating, this could have this negative, wider consequence of wild animals in the natural habitats, right? But you mentioned that there could be a way forward in that we pursue. So antinatalists can pursue doing good in the way that sort of really resonates with them, and pursue encouraging people to reduce birth rates, which in turn would presumably reduce the number of animals we're directly exploiting. Mm-hmm. But that could manage the issue of wild animal suffering and potentially not result in that negative consequence of wild animal suffering increasing. Did you have any sort of like specific examples of that in mind when you made that comment, or is yeah, go on.
Yeah. It's not so much that I had specific examples as the idea that, you know, for example, if the number of people in existence dropped, let's say by 10%, would we really expect a lot more wild animals to come into being? In the sense of, you know, to the extent that we already have a certain fraction of the Earth's surface already sort of covered in concrete, you know, that won't necessarily change. It could be that even if fewer people, they'll continue to consume more resources. It was more of just putting the idea out there that there wouldn't necessarily be a reversal of the decline in wild animals just because there's fewer people are born. Now, of course, you know, over time, we see how sort of nature comes back, you know, when places are abandoned. So it's not an absolute, prediction or anything. It's just saying that there's not necessarily a direct
Yeah.
direct relationship.
And how do you think about because you also mentioned AI, right? So AI, is massive in public discourse at the moment, and obviously in its various conceptions, it's being integrated into public and private life and companies and governments and things like this. Um, and there's generally this sense, obviously, that even though there have been already quite big changes in how we do at least certain tasks, there are radical changes because of AI coming in the near future. How and that gives us a lot of uncertainty over what is the future even going to look like? What tools are we going to have access to? Could this make preventing intense suffering harder? How do you deal with the uncertainty that something like AI brings to the question of reducing suffering? Is there any way you've managed to sort of navigate that?
We're actually working on a policy paper on that, right at the moment, that we're hoping to put out pretty soon. And we've been, speaking to various people working in AI safety, to get a sense for sort of the margin of maneuver within that space. And yeah, there are various ways that AI can cause suffering, which I alluded to in my talk. Probably the worst thing that could happen is for AI to completely take over control, for us to lose control over AI, because we would no longer have any control over our ability to really reduce suffering on a large scale, even though we might not know what trajectory things take after that. So I think the strongest recommendation, I made this recommendation in the Tango of Ethics and also in compassionate governance, is the idea that we should really be fighting to maintain control. Some people have this, I think, somewhat overly optimistic idea that AI would do a better job than we do, but I do think that's optimistic. I think that if you have reasonable and compassionate human beings that are in the loop and they're able to jump in, that's a safer scenario where we just give up our whole control over our future to AI. That's really the strongest conclusion I would make. That we seem to be converging on.
How do you think we're generally doing on that front?
Pretty badly.
Yeah.
I think just in general, this is the whole thing. We need to be optimistic in order to make a difference, and we still need to be taking steps to get rid of as much suffering as we can, regardless of what the future scenarios are. But it does seem that our world is being, it's being driven by greed, the concentration of wealth, and things like a focus on GDP and increasing shareholder value. These are incredibly strong drivers of the evolution of our complex system. And AI, I encourage people to read a section on AI, and also, well, in another part of the guide, I think we refer to an essay by Scott Alexander called Meditations on Moloch, which is really just the idea that there are these sort of drives that are built into human nature, and I guess built into evolutionary processes and the evolution of life altogether. And AI basically just puts things on steroids. That the last few decades of sort of growth and relative reductions in poverty and increases in well-being for many people might have been more of a blip than a representation of what the future will be like. So the system in itself, in a sense, seems to have its own dynamics, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible to shift the system with a movement that's very value based and empathetic, and practical. And this is my hope.
Yeah. And you mentioned some of the potential complications, shall we say, that might come from promoting antinatalism, right? I wondered if you had any thoughts on how the 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 way that antinatalism can fit in to furthering the reduction of intense suffering. And just to put a bit of a note on that question, so often when people refer to antinatalism, they're generally referring to the specific prescription not to reproduce personally, right? The way and I know a lot of other people conceive of antinatalism, though, is that generally we should be avoiding creating sentient beings. So this would obviously then have implications for like our food choices, for example, not paying for animals to be put into existence in farms, for example.
Yeah.
If we break it down into the sort of human question and animal question, or break it down in any other way you'd like, are there aspects of reducing intense suffering that antinatalism can play more of a part in than in other parts? How do you think about that?
I mean, to be really honest, I think that I would reframe the question instead.
Right.
The ultimate question is, how can we both be most effective in reducing or preventing suffering, however you want to frame it? And antinatalism, in a limited sense, can play a part. And I would especially refer to to not bringing animals into existence who are going to suffer. I mean, I think just in terms of scale, there are 8 billion humans, and there are nearly 100 billion land animals that are consumed by humans every year. And I would wholeheartedly endorse the idea that we don't bring any of those animals into existence, because most of them are made to suffer. Not the suffering is not the purpose, but it's the result.
Yeah.
So that alone is a strong endorsement of antinatalism in that very specific sense. Would you like me to comment on the human part,
No, you can, but I actually I agree with you there. I think often when people, so if an antinatalist was watching your talk, right, they may think that they may despair slightly, because if they're very aligned with your sort of idea of we want to reduce intense suffering, they might kind of despair in that you're suggesting promoting human antinatalism, should we say, is maybe not the most effective way forward. But I think that despair is slightly misplaced in that, look, like many of the antinatalists watching, I too resonate a lot with promoting, with conveying the antinatalist message to fellow humans. But I think the antinatalist case is actually even stronger when it comes to creating animals into existence, like it sounds like you're saying as well. And so I actually don't think there's as much reason for despair as some antinatalists may do when they hear the message that you're conveying, because there's still massive room for antinatalism to play a part in reducing intense suffering. It's just maybe not in the popular conception of antinatalism, if you get what I mean.
I think that makes sense. And also, I would say, I would be very wary. I'd be wary. I mean, I don't have children, and even though at some point that was part of the plan, I feel, in some ways, I feel more comfortable knowing that I'm not bringing somebody into existence who might experience intense suffering. I think it's still a relevant message that humans should not be bringing new humans into existence unless they at least can take the precautions needed to ensure that they have the best life possible and really reduce the chances of them suffering, extremely. So, and obviously that's not the case for many humans. And, I was talking just before about the survey that we did, and there are many cases of people who suffered bullying in school that has had severe consequences in their lives, people that have been abused by their parents. People who are going to be abusive parents obviously shouldn't be bringing children into the world either. unfortunately, I think the people that are concerned about suffering and the people that are abusive parents are not a very overlapping set. But yeah, I mean, I'm just pointing that out. I'm certainly not saying that everybody should just go ahead and have lots of children so we can get rid of wild animals. I mean, I'm in a way, I'm actually saying the opposite. That that we could probably. It is possible that with fewer humans around and fewer animals being consumed, it's possible that there would be a net reduction in suffering. But it may not. That may not be the case. It may be the opposite. And I think again, I haven't looked at the numbers closely enough, and there's still so much uncertainty. Like I was saying.
So we've got time for one more brief question. So antinatalists, quite obviously, generally tend not to raise children, right? Some do adopt, some already have children, but generally antinatalists. So compared to their sort of similar counterparts, they're probably going to have slightly more resources, more time to put towards efforts to reduce intense suffering, right? Or tackle intense suffering. In maybe like 30 seconds or however quickly you can do it, if someone in that position could start to think about how they personally can engage with tackling intense suffering, where should they focus their attention to, would you say?
Okay, I would put it this way. First of all, obviously go vegan. And I don't even mean like absolute purity check. I mean, okay, I check labels because I don't, but definitely avoid causing harm to animals through your eating habits. Identify organizations that you think are having impact and either volunteer or donate or work with them. And if you think you've got some really good ideas that are not being currently applied and you think you have the ability or can bring in people with that ability, start an organization, do something very active yourself. If you have ideas that you think that are worth spreading, to use that term, and that are not sufficiently being spread, do that. And just as a general way of living, be the change you want to see in the world. Try to act in a way that would be a good model for others to act by.
Yeah, no, that's a great message. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I'm sorry we didn't have more time. This is the same with Magnus. I had so many more questions that I wanted to get through, but yeah, maybe we've handicapped ourselves by keeping the sessions at 55 minutes. But yeah, thank you so much for giving up your time and giving the presentation as well. And yeah, we'll end it there.
Okay, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks very much for inviting me.